Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I don't know if you caught it there, but Cantor was alluding to a verb.
Yes.
It was a verb.
Yes, it was a verb.
It was.
Shake your hand.
Yes.
It was a verb.
It was a verb. That psalm shares with this week's Torah portion, Naso in that psalm and Naso. I'm sure you all got that.
Their ears perked up.
Indeed they did. At first I thought you were going with a water motif because of the bitter waters, but all right. That one clearly didn't land.
Sort of flow.
Yeah. For a different crowd. Okay. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi.
This week, we are in Parshat Naso. We are in the second parsha of the book of Numbers, a book detailing our ancestors' wandering Bamidbar, in the wilderness. You can imagine that for as long as we read this book this year, we'll be thinking about all the ways in which we too are Bamidbar, in a desolate wasteland of confusion and misdirection, uncertain of where we're headed. Let's face it, a book called In the Wilderness automatically resonates in 2025 when we consider just how much we feel like we're lost right now. Sad, anxious, and desperate for a Moses to lead us to a promised land. I wish that Parshat Naso gave us something pithy to hold on to, some juicy narrative that we could really relate to, given the global thrust toward authoritarianism, the rise of anti-Semitism, and the trauma of the war in Gaza. Or if not that, something uplifting that might make us smile and give us hope. But instead of all that, we get a census. And if that weren't tedious enough, it's the same census we were working on last week. Parashat Naso begins in medias res. Naso et rosh b'nei Gershon gam hem. Take a census of the Gershonites also, God says to Moses. As the word gam, or also, suggests, this Torah portion continues the story of counting the Israelites by their names and by their tribes as they continue their wandering in the desert. When last we met Moses at the end of Parashat Bamidbar, after counting the number of male adults fit for war, he turns to the Levites, the specific tribe of Israel tasked with spiritual service. And what follows into this week's parsha is a description of the different subgroups of Levites who played distinct roles in the priestly cult. You likely know the Kohanim, the priests, those descendants of Levi through Yocheved and Aaron. But how about the Levitical cousins, the slightly less famous ones? They all are deputized to be different administrators in the ancient temple, but not clergy outright. Last week's parsha ends with describing one of them, the Kohathites, descended from a different son of Levi, Kehat. These Levites didn't get to perform sacrifices, but instead their special role entailed carrying the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant. And here, at the outset of Naso, we meet the Gershonites, a different subgroup from yet another son, Gershon. The phrasing is mostly identical to the way the Torah describes the Kohathites and the Merarites, the final Levite subgroup, also described in this week's parsha, in this census. Lemishbechotam levet avotam, according to their families and their fathers' houses. Each of these three Levite tribes are counted in the same way. But only the Gershonites at the beginning of this week's parsha are noted gam hem, with the words meaning and also them. If all three are described identically, but only the Gershonites get a gam hem attached to their description, what then might be the unique significance of the Gershonites in contradistinction to the other two? At this point, you could be forgiven if you were falling asleep. Oh my God, the rabbi is talking about some obscure flourish in the Torah portion, and also the Gershonites? Okay. Is this really the most action-packed part of the parsha, you might wonder? And the truth is, no, it's not. The rest of the parsha deals with the punishment for adulterous wives. So we're going to stick with the Gershonites. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, the great Talmud translator and rabbinic commentator who died just a few years ago, points out something important about this specific group of Levites. Unlike the Kohathites, mentioned last week, who were tasked with carrying the ark, the most important vessel of the priestly cult, and unlike the Merarites, who are chosen in this week's Parsha to carry the boards of the Mishkan, the most basic elements of the tabernacle, the Gershonites were somewhere in between. They handled the things that needed to be handled, the ropes and materials that made the Mishkan function, but which were neither totally sacred nor totally mundane. The Kohathites could say that they were stewards of the most sacred aspects of the Mishkan. They were exalted and special. The Merarites could say that they made the whole thing work, assembling the scaffolding upon which everything else stood, and feel satisfied that they had made something that you could look at. But the Gershonites had less of a finished product to point to when they completed their task. One set of their cousins built the structure, another carried the most important parts, and of course their most famous cousins, the Kohanim, got to eat all of the meat and get near all of the action. But for the Gershonites, they had to accept their role as middle managers. Rabbi Steinsaltz explains that this role was essential to the Mishkan as every other role was. But being stuck in the middle must have felt deeply unsatisfying. Because of this, he writes, the Torah emphasizes, take a census of Gershon's sons also, because these people must be remembered. They must be uplifted and told in essence that the Kohathites did not take all of the best jobs. According to Steinsaltz, the reason this week's Parsha begins with the Gershonites was to remind them that they mattered. That being in the middle, however exhausting and unglorified it might be, is still an honor. And of course, in many ways, the middle is what allows the whole enterprise to function. This, my friends, is a sweet reminder to any of us who likewise feel that our middling at times goes without notice in our lives, at work, possibly in our personal lives. When we feel like just because we're not the boss who gets all the power, nor the laborer who does the most basic things and can see the fruits of their labors before their eyes, that somehow our hard work amounts to very little. Instead, says Steinsaltz, following this Parsha, it all actually really matters. The middle really matters. Not only is the work distinct, we might say, with its own significant impact, but let's be clear, neither the top nor the bottom would be able to do their jobs without the unglamorous work of the middle. It turns out that being in the middle, or being between, has a special significance in our tradition. For what it's worth, Maimonides was kind of obsessed with the state of being in the middle. In his Mishnah Torah, he referred to middling people as Benonim, intermediate ones. And in his understanding, most of humanity is Benoni, which is to say, neither perfectly righteous nor perfectly wicked. For this reason, he believed that every person must always try to do what's right, as if every choice we make in this life really matters, so that we can tip the scale of our lives toward morality and justice, because otherwise we would just be right in the middle. Following Maimonides' lead, I think I'm also kind of obsessed with being in the middle. Even though being in the middle can feel like being torn asunder by two sides that I love, two opposing poles that are each certain that they are right at any given moment. As you can imagine, interpersonally and even spiritually, rabbis wind up being in the middle of two sides quite frequently. It's baked into our role. But all of us as Jews are often also in the middle, at the intersection of competing values, sometimes opposite groups of people, holding both our universal and our particular responsibilities. Being caught in between is excruciating generally, but it's even harder these days, when our political and cultural zeitgeist presupposes that being in the middle is an abdication of moral responsibility. This, of course, applies both to the American political landscape and to the Jewish one, where if you choose not to stick to a script, you will be excoriated by one side or the other. It applies to any of us who are trying to maintain our senses of self while being in relationship with people of dramatically different backgrounds. And notably, it applies to all of us who are desperate to hold our deep familial commitments to care for Israel and Israelis in equipoise with our human, humanitarian, and Jewish commitments to care for Palestinians. Being between does not necessarily mean being in the exact middle of a continuum between two opposite poles. Very frequently, being between means being closer to one side than the other, maybe so close to a side that it appears almost indistinguishable to an outside observer. But being in between allows for the possibility of movement, of change. Just as neither a tzaddik nor rasha can be changed on Yom Kippur, those who are convinced that they are uniquely correct or pure in their views cannot be moved. But typically, they can't move others either. By contrast, the ones in between can do both. And in a time when we all know something's got to give, that the world must be moved and also move forward, how can we not accept the mantle of remaining Benoni? I draw this connection, friends, because from our many conversations in recent weeks, I can tell that there's a creeping malaise in this community about always having to hold on to complexity or competing values or making space in our hearts for as many different kinds of people as possible. A sense that being in the middle has been painful and would be so much easier for all of us maybe to give up or merely to pick a side. But as I read that commentary about the Gershonites this week, obscure though it was, I thought of us all, in need of a little koach, a little boost, to remember that though remaining in the middle can feel unsatisfying or maybe impotent, oftentimes playing that role is not only good, but essential. Shabbat shalom.